Once upon a time, it was against the law to fly unless you had a licensed pilot in a certified aeroplane. For a while, that all changed. This is the aeroplane that changed it. The 1975 Red Baron Skycraft-Scout. Built by Ron Wheeler in December 1975, after he heard that the Department of Transport Air Navigation Branch had got a hold of rumours that he was putting lawnmower engines onto the Tweety hang gliders that he was importing at the time, and he heard he was supposed to stop. And instead of stopping, he built this thing, and he invited them to come and look at it, and he asked them to pretty please consider writing a law which allowed it to be acceptable to play with these things. They laughed, they went home, they wrote the law. In 1976, the Australian Parliament gazetted Air Navigation Order 95.10, which stated, a minimum aircraft is to have a takeoff weight not exceeding 400 pounds. The minimum aircraft is not to be flown above 300 feet from terrain. It's not to be flown within 5 miles of a licensed airport or controlled airspace, not to cross municipal boundaries, not to overfly a public meeting or a regatta, not to cross roads. And if you wanted to sit in something that you'd built in your backyard and go for a fly, not harm anybody, you were allowed to do that. I thought it was great. Once it was legal for him to do so, Ron Wheeler then produced a run of 12 Mark I Skycraft-Scouts, and the Mark I had a bigger engine, whereas the pre-production prototypes had the Pixie Minor Aero-Engine, which was only 8 horsepower. And compare that to the Wright brothers, who had 12.5 horsepower. The Pixie Major made it into the textbooks. It had 14 horsepower. Here is the textbook in question. Bill Gunston, OBE, FRAES, former RAF pilot and flying instructor, arguably Britain's best known aviation writer with over 380 books published during his 50-year career. He lives in Surrey. And on page 193, he says, Wheeler, Australia. The Pixie Major is another single-cylinder two-stroke with a capacity of 173cc, 10.56 cubic inches, and maximum output on 4% oil mix of 14 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. Weight, including exhaust unit, is 8.6 kilograms or 19 pounds. So the first 12 production Skycraft-Scouts, they had more power than the Wright brothers, but they only had 2-axis controls, whereas the Wright brothers had 3, and the Wright brothers had a double-surface wing, whereas the Skycraft-Scouts had a single-surface wing. So yeah, you know, a bit iffy, more or less comparable to the Wright brothers, I suppose, kind of. Meanwhile, Ron Wheeler sold the Red Baron Scout to a bloke called Neil Cotty, and he was the bigwig at Pacific Films. He was chairman of the board of directors and managing director, and he wanted to have a vintage airfield in Australia near where he lived at Bowral. So he bought the Berrima Aero Club and he renamed it Oldie Bowral Airfieldy. And I've actually got that in a magazine. Here we have the January-February 1977 Australian Flying Magazine, in which page 16 and page 17 are devoted to Oldie Bowral Airfieldy. And if you come down to the bottom of page 16, also based is a Skycraft-Scout powered hang glider painted overall red with World War I black iron cross markings. The aircraft takes place in the mock battle fought during the displays. Well, maybe that was the plan. There were all sorts of funny things there, including a children's amusement version of an SE-5A, which was put on display to round out the numbers of aeroplanes. And here behind the second tiger moth, if you look real hard, you can just see the tail and the wing of the Skycraft-Scout, the Red Baron, with its black Maltese crosses on its white panels. So by January 1977, it was at Old Bowral Airfield, which is kind of where I enter the story, because in 1978 I wrote to Neil Cotty and I told him how many Biggles books I'd read and how much I'd read of Richard Bach and what an aeroplane freak I was and how I thought he should be building a sop with camel instead of a sop with pup. And in among all the garbage, I said that I'd dearly love to work at his airfield on his aeroplanes, and I'd do it for nothing, just for the fun of it. And Neil said, oh look, I can't have you work for nothing. every day you work there I'll give you a flying lesson. So what would you have said when you were 17? So I sort of snuck out of the boarding school and made it to Neil Cotty's place, and he drove me out to his airfield, and my first job was to help scrape the paint off VHASC, which was to be repainted in bright red with white panels and black Maltese crosses so that it could do dogfights at the flying displays for times when there were paperwork problems with the Fokker triplane. Neil was going the whole hog. He'd bought a Fokker triplane in California and brought it to Australia, but the problem is no Australian engineer had ever seen the inside of its wooden wing spars. Therefore it couldn't qualify for a certificate of airworthiness, and it was flying on permits to fly. The Sopwith Pup was scratch built from plans by Transavia at Camden. And being in charge of a photographic company, Neil was able to get some pretty amazing photographic surveys achieved under the heading of advertising and promotion. Well, anyway, the school heard that I was flying without school permission. Neil was taking me up in a 1936 Piper Cub. No, 1934 Piper Cub, and the next day it was a 1936 Hornet Moth. And I got suspended for a fortnight, and it wasn't until the end of the school year, after doing the final exams, that I was able to get back to the airfield. And I stayed there for a fortnight. At the end of the fortnight we had an argument over money, and I refused to take money, so I wound up the owner of the Red Baron Scout on a bit of a take the aeroplane now and finish paying for it later basis, but it was mine. And what would any other young red-blooded Biggles fantasist do? Okay, so I think it was the 27th of November 1978, that thing taught me how to fly. And at Bowral I got it 3 foot off the ground up and down the runway a few times, and it worked pretty well. So I loaded it on top of my Morris 1100 and tied it on, and I left the tail on it for what I thought was better stability. It was a bloody stupid idea looking back on it. And I went into the local police station and I got a written permit for a wide load to carry a light aircraft on the roof of a Morris 1100. And I got stopped about 13 times over the next 500 miles by curious highway patrol officers who'd seen this crazy permit come through the teleprinter, and they couldn't believe it. But anyway, that's a picture of my first aeroplane on my first car, with me out on the extreme side there. And there's a picture where you can actually see me wearing a World War II vintage Army surplus store flying helmet. And there's the Victa-160 in all of its glory. And I'd had to tie the propeller because at highway speeds the damn thing rotated, and I actually cracked it going under a low-hanging sign, so I had to repair the propeller before I tried to fly it again. And this is my cousin Greg Shaw sitting on the bonnet. He's a lot older than that now. So 1979 I had a go at flying it at Glen Innes on a hot day in January, and the density altitude beat it, and the aluminium bushes at the wheel hubs seized on the steel axles, and the nylon wheels rotated on the bushes, and I actually melted the wheel hubs out of it. Took me a long time to fix that. And then, probably due to the bad repair job I did on the propeller and the vibrations coming back down the chain to the crankshaft snapped, and my father fixed that. And that was the extent of the flying I did with it. I got it off the ground at Bowral, which is 2,000 feet above sea level, but here at Glen Innes, 3,650 feet on a hot day in January, there was no way. It wasn't an aeroplane, not even in ground effect. So in 1980, I went down to Sydney to go training as a general nurse, and I left the Skycraft-Scout in the backyard. 1981 I got in trouble with the law, and my parents sold it to help defray the legal costs, and it went to Inverell, and it went to a bloke called Terry Griffey. He had a go at flying it once, and just as he was doing the engine run on the airfield, the propeller bolt snapped, and the propeller that I'd badly repaired flew off into the distance and broke itself to pieces. And by the time he got a new propeller on it, time had moved on, and ultralights had got better, and he never ever wanted to fly it again. Therefore, thus and because, in 2000 I heard by way of rumour that my old aeroplane had survived, it hadn't hurt itself, it hadn't hurt anybody, and it was chained to the roof at the Inverell Transport Museum. So I took my kids over for a pilgrimage to meet Daddy's first aeroplane. In the intervening years I kept an eye on Skycraft-Scouts, even tore the occasional clipping out. When the Mark III came out, they had wing warping, so they were 3-axis controls. 18 horsepower instead of 14 horsepower. The Mark III could also cope with a 35 horsepower Rotax. Took a little bit of extra structural work to cope with the weight of the engine. And for people who were real thrill seekers, there was the Sea Scout. Can you imagine? 18 horsepower, single surface wing with wing warping for roll control on floats. What an amazingly optimistic creation that was. But the memory of my first aeroplane had been perpetuated, because in my wallet is a photo of it. So there they are at age 10 and 11, and the fella on the left of the picture is Terry Griffey, the bloke who had his propeller break, and there it is with a brand new propeller. My first aeroplane, chained to the ceiling in a transport museum. What an amazing boost to the ego. Here it is, a lovely write-up. And a slightly computer distorted photo showing all the glory of an aeroplane that was worse than what the Wright brothers had. See that little grey mark on the leading edge? That's a piece of spinnaker sailcloth that I sewed and doped on there to cover the frayed patch caused by the aluminium wing spars chafing on the 500-mile car journey. And by way of comparison, we go from the pre-production prototype Red Baron Scout with a 35 horsepower Rotax engined Mark III with wing warping that my old mate Canada John used to fly until he flew a kamikaze attack on a sheep on the 10th of September 1995. He got his sheep, but he didn't survive to talk about it. Now I suppose the big question is, if I was allowed, would I do it again? Would I pull that thing out of the museum and spend a couple of weeks playing with it and bringing it up to code? And would I fly now at age 50 what I flew when I was 17? And I probably would. Just out of the sheer nostalgia, it was the greatest fun I've ever had. Nobody in the world has ever flown a worse aeroplane than that except me and Ron Wheeler and anybody else who flew it before he sold it to Neil Cotty. Because everything else I've ever flown had a better performance, and therefore it wasn't quite as challenging as that old Red Baron Scout. The worse an aeroplane handles, the harder it is to fly, the more satisfying it is. So the more foolproof they become with the more autopilots, the more boring they become, and that's why people revolted away from Cessnas in the 1960s and went hang gliding. It's why we had the ultralight revolution. And now you can have ultralights with 250 horsepower motors. So, you know, it's getting a bit stupid, isn't it? And of course, nowadays you have to have an ultralight pilot certificate or a recreational aircraft licence, and you've got to be certified. So, the golden age is gone. Ciao. 8 horsepower, single surface wings, 2-axis controls. The Wright brothers had a better aeroplane. But gee, I loved it.